Hello, my name is Moses Femino, and on this episode of University Television Presents, we welcome David Abraham, a distinguished author and expert on global research supply chains. David is here at Boise State University as a guest of the College of Engineering to discuss his latest book, which explores the critical role of rare earth materials in modern technology and industry. Rare earth elements are essential for everything from smartphones to renewable energy systems, and their extraction and supply raises significant geopolitical and environmental questions. Today, we'll dive into his research, uncover the hidden world of these crucial resources, and explore what their future holds. Welcome to the program, David.
Thank you.
We really appreciate you for joining us today. Let's just dive right into it. To start, can you give us a brief overview of your book and what inspired you to write about rare earth materials?
So what inspired me to write was an experience I had when I was in Japan. So I was in Japan in 2010. I had a great fellowship. I was at the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. Now it's a large industry, a large ministry within the Japanese government that was focused on supply lines, economic development, and industrial growth. So it was a large ministry within the government. And at that time, there was a territorial dispute between China and Japan. And at that moment, China had restricted the exports of these rare materials. Now, I was based at the ministry, and I was surprised at the reaction that the restriction of these minerals made Japan very, very nervous. And I was wondering what a material was that made people so nervous. It wasn't like oil. It was something that was very esoteric, something I knew little about. And I had already been working in energy trading. So I thought I knew what materials were important, but hey, there was a whole new set of materials. So after 2010, I spent a couple of years traveling the world, from Estonia to Brazil to China, to really understand what were these materials and why they were so important to modern life. And that's where my interest stemmed from.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I actually, stemming off of those questions of traveling around the world, I saw that you had major experience in Uganda and doing stuff, all this different. What was your favorite experience from all of those different, from Uganda to Britain to,
Sure. So I worked in Uganda. I was running a nonprofit building clean water wells in northern Uganda. I initially left university and I went to teach English in Japan. It was actually the first time I really ever left the country. And so I've always had an interest in my career to see the international overlay over a number of issues. And minerals, mining, materials was something that had an international component, because you can choose where to put a building that makes mugs, but you can't choose where the minerals are buried in the ground. And so I was always fascinated about those, that interplay. And I think one of the most fascinating places I've ever been was a small place in Brazil called Araxá. Now, Araxá is very rich in minerals. And in the niobium world, which is a world where, or niobium is a metal that's a steel strengthener, 85% of the world's niobium comes from this particular mine. At the same time, it's one of the most beautiful places. And so what you have is this strange dichotomy where you have one of the richest mines in the world next to some of the most beautiful places in the world where tourism and mining have to coexist. And maybe that's similar to what's happening here in Idaho.
Absolutely.
So I really appreciated that juxtaposition. So I found that one of the most fascinating places I've ever been.
That sounds like a beautiful place to go. Kind of jumping back onto your experiences in Japan and China. China dominates the global supply of rare earth materials. How did they establish this dominance, and how does that impact countries like the United States?
It's a great question. I think there are a number of factors that pushed China to be the dominant producer of not only rare earth elements, but a whole subset of critical minerals, from selenium and tellurium to bismuth. And the main factors that I look at for rare earths is, one, they had some very good deposits. And they had mines that were producing iron ore, for example, and it had a rich side product of rare earth elements. So that's one factor. They had some good geology. Then they also had some opportunities because they had a weak regulatory environment, so that the environmental regulations were not historically as strong as the rest of the world. And I think three, which is also underappreciated, was that they needed the materials. So they were coming out of a time where they were switching from making the world's t-shirts and Christmas lights to starting to look at how it was producing batteries and motors. And when you have demand for a material, you're focusing on how you can develop that material. So in some sense, supply lines are pulled because the end product is produced there. It figures how it can bring along the intermediary steps. So you've got weak environmental regulations, you have some good geological fortune, and you have some demand that's there. So those are kind of the three main aspects.
I gotcha. I remember watching a documentary growing up in, I believe, middle school, and the whole basis of it was geographic luck. You know, sometimes you just kind of fell into these amazing deposits of whatever it may be, and it's not really, there's no explanation. It just kind of happens that way. Rare earth mining has significant environmental consequences, obviously, kind of based like the Brazil conversation, not ruining, you know, the natural beauty of that place. What are some of the biggest challenges, and are there sustainable alternatives to this?
Sure. I think what we all have to take a step back and realize, everything we do, we choose, has some environmental impact. The buying of more clothes, the buying of a new phone. The question is how do we mitigate? How do we use resources wisely? But the development of rare earth minerals, yes, it can be heavily taxing on the environment. Depends how it's done. You also have to consider a lot of these materials have radioactive elements associated with them. So that when you're taking the earth from the ground and you start to refine the materials to get a higher and higher grade of rare earth concentrate, if you will, you're also creating a concentrated form of what was radioactive in the ground, but now is heavily concentrated. So I think what you have to do is use the best environmental standards that you have to produce the material. At the same time, we do have to realize that there are trade-offs between economic development, or the fact that everyone has a phone, or that we need a strong military defense, that there are going to be some environmental impacts. And the question is how do we appreciate the products that we have, and how do we make them last longer? And how do we, knowing what we know to our best ability, mitigate those negative externalities?
Absolutely. I really love that point, because I feel like many people, you know, don't really think about that. The little things of buying a shirt at the thrift store and all that other, like these impact our environment.
If you can make something last longer, if you can respect the product and the fact that half the elements are known to man are in that phone. And yes, we want to talk about recycling, but you can't pull out all of the materials that are in a lot of the products that we use. They're made to be used, not made to be recycled. And so I think there's a greater appreciation increasingly that the products that we make didn't come from the iPhone, from the Apple store. It came from the ground somewhere in China, or it came from Brazil or Namibia.
I couldn't agree. It's important to be conscious of those little things that we don't think about on the regular. Over the next decade, how do you see rare earth material use evolving, especially with the rise of renewable energy and electric vehicles? I'm sure in your local area you've seen them all over the roads. But
Right. It's the history of resource use tells us we will use more. We use more paper than we ever have before, but we don't read as many books. You know, we continue to use more and more supply, and because these materials are critical for green technologies, because they're incredibly important for robotics, they're important for medical equipment, they're going to be increasingly used. So the demand will continue to rise. Supply will come up in some way. The question is where and when. But there is no question that these materials will continue to be important. What we have to do as an industry is to be able to develop these materials in newer and more efficient ways so that we can turn these materials from specialty materials, in essence, to commodities, so that we can start to use the power of these materials, because they do present tremendous opportunities. They create, if we can use these materials to create a more powerful battery, then our cars last longer. And they can go further on a charge, and we can reduce our reliance on oil and gas. If we can figure out how to make the car lighter, again, it can last longer and go further. If we're able to make a material stronger, then our airplanes will be able to last longer. And so it's a question of how do we harness the power of these materials, at the same time reducing what impacts they have.
Makes sense. It's the age-old question of supply and demand. It's going to be, until our old age, it's going to be the same old thing. But if universities or governments like Boise State College of Engineering, for example, want to make a difference in this field, what steps should they take? What would you recommend us doing?
I think by understanding the materials,
Yes.
A greater focus on material science, a greater focus on where stuff comes from, broadly speaking. I think it's the education process that's the most important into the supply line, into how things get to us. Because when I grew up, it was coming, the Atari was coming out of the box.
Yeah.
And we didn't realize that everything around us, it's either wood, and actually I don't know if this is wood, but if it's wood, it's grown, and if it's not, then it's pulled out from the ground, and we can't build up unless we dig down. And I think that's one of the realities when I was writing this book that really dawned on me. Even though I had been in this space and I had been in commodities trading, I didn't realize the extent that we are reliant on the earth to produce the most high-tech goods that we have.
I love it. I love that quote. Is that a quote in the book somewhere? We can't build up unless we dig down. I love that. I love that quote. Your career has spanned various sectors, as we've talked about. How have these diverse experiences shaped your perspective on global resource management?
I think one of the most fascinating aspects of as global resource management, as you say, is that it weighs in on so many different industries, organizations, sectors. So you have mining, and that affects local populations. And then the mining has its own focus. It doesn't really think about the local populations. How do we get the resource out? The material scientists are thinking, how do we use the material once it comes out of the ground? The local politicians are thinking, how do we maximize revenue for it to grow sustainably so the housing prices don't all go up and there's not a boom and bust cycle. You have Apples and the Dells of the world concerned about, how do I get this component? And so what you have is that you have a lot of different people looking at the sector from different vantage points. And all of them have a little bit of a different language. And you can't speak to a material scientist the same way you speak to local population. You can't speak to mining engineers the same way you speak to government. So I've had the good fortune in my career to work in government. So I understand their acronyms and how they think. I ran an NGO, so I get the language that they speak. So I think the most important thing through my career, which I've been having good fortune, is to know that if you can speak the language of the people that you're talking to, then you can ask them anything. Yeah. And you can be curious. But trying to understand how they talk about things is one of the most important things. Yeah, and to be able to relate to them.
Definitely a big challenge, and I bet is a big intersection in bridging those gaps between those different sectors. Obviously, you've traveled extensively, as we've noted, crossing numerous borders. Is there a particular experience or story from these places that profoundly impacted your views?
Oh my, yeah, they're always a bunch, and I think the most important thing to me about travel hasn't been how do I perceive other countries. It's how do I reflect upon my own country and my own beliefs. Because what's normal here, how we drink beer, how we how we cook a meal, how we think about our relationships to our neighbors is very different than the experiences I have in Japan or Indonesia. And there's not just one type of experience, but I think it's being able to reflect upon my own country and some of the biases that I have as an individual and we have as a country, that living overseas helps me appreciate. And I don't necessarily come back with answers, but I come back with either questions or an understanding, hey, the way we think about it may not be always the right way.
100%. I couldn't agree more about that. I'm Kenyan. My mom's side of the family is African. So when I went over there, the exact same thing. It just opens your mind to all these questions that you've never thought of before living in America. So I fully understand that. One more question here for you. Are there viable recycling methods or alternative materials that could reduce our dependence on these newly mined rare earth elements?
I think what you said at the last three words, the newly mined, that's really the challenge that we face. So a lot of the materials that we love to recycle are just recently coming into use. So it's very difficult to recycle a wind turbine that is put out in 2020 until 2035, 2040, 2045. So you don't have a lot of rich, as we say, or we don't have a lot of resources that are occurring at the end of their life that use these heavy amounts of these resources. So it's a challenge. The other thing is, have you ever tried to take apart your iPhone? It's very difficult.
Yeah.
And so the products themselves aren't made for there's not a nugget of neodymium that you can just take out of the phone or dysprosium. They're blended in, so it becomes very complicated to get the resources out. So while recycling is an important at the margins now, it will be becoming increasingly more so, but it will never be the major source in the medium term for any type of sustainable supply going forward.
Okay. Sorry, I said one more. Last one for you. Beyond environmental concerns, are there ethical issues surrounding labor conditions or the economic exploration in the rare earth industry?
I think environmental is a large one. Ethical, because you're mining in certain places in Myanmar and Laos, where the environment's secondary, or in the case of Myanmar, where there's a civil war. We have a large amount of material over the past 2 years coming into the global supply chain that does end up in our phones, that comes from a war-torn area. So I think understanding where our resources come from will help to start to highlight some of these challenges that maybe are not brought to the fore at this moment.
Absolutely. I feel like that's a very important thing to be cognizant of just, instead of just using these things, we got to know where we're getting them, where they come from. So, David, I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks,
this has been a very fascinating conversation. I've learned a ton in our short time here, and I would love to learn more after this.
Great.
But thank you for sharing your insight with us. Before we wrap up, where can people learn more about your work and what's next for you?
Oh, what's next for me? I'm fascinated to continue to learn more about how these critical minerals are used. Looking at also writing and continuing from the book that I wrote many years back.
Yeah, awesome.
Great.
I appreciate that.
Thanks.
Well, thank you again for joining us on University Television Presents. To our viewers at home, thank you very much for watching. Stay tuned for more conversations with thought-leading leaders shaping our world. Thank you.